Hello and welcome to Orbiting Brick. In today's video, as you see, we're starting off with a fairly strange rocket. This is because, as you saw in the title and thumbnail, we're sending a Zeppelin to Sonnah, so this is going to require a fairly large rocket to get a fairly large payload to a destination that shouldn't take that much out of you. But yeah, you can see 20 mammoth engines, and even still a fairly low thrust-weight ratio on liftoff. I'm definitely gonna get drowned out by these engines right now, so I'll stay quiet for a bit. But yeah, this is possibly the most Kerbal rocket I've made in a while. Not only does it have multiple cores, usually those cores has multiple cores. I used some tweak scale on those stack couplers there. They go from 2.5 meter diameter to 1.25 meter diameter. Scaled them up so that they would fit 3.75 meter diameter parts. And the rest of the vehicle was made using parts from near future launch vehicles, which are 7.5 meters in diameter. The actual Zeppelin itself you'll see later on, since it needs to be protected by a payload fairing for atmospheric entry to Sonnah. Yeah, I'm speeding up the launch since it's a fairly slow ascent. And we actually have some fuel crossfeed from the boosters to the main core. Trying to be as efficient as possible with this, since this was a surprisingly difficult vehicle to make work. It turns out that Zeppelins are surprisingly heavy, and deorbiting yourself around the planet you're orbiting, it also apparently takes a surprising amount of delta V. But yeah, we're doing a fairly standard ascent. Originally, this vehicle had a far more steep ascent profile since it had very low thrust-weight ratio upper stages, but redesigns meant I could follow a more standard flight profile. And fairly soon I'm gonna make a small mistake where I pitch over slightly before separating the boosters, which causes first a lag spike and then some minor explosions. I'm sure it's fine. The main rocket was unharmed. We can continue ascending. Now this is essentially an evolution of the balloon-based probes I've been doing lately, as well as the probe I did to Sonnah. And also I did this because with my non-New Horizon Space Race videos, I want to do stuff that just won't be too similar to stuff I'll likely do in that video in the series. Since I want to ensure that the stuff in the New Horizon Space Race, it feels different from my other content. This is definitely something that's highly impractical and should never be attempted in a career mode. But yeah, I completely skipped over a stage separation, and also adjusting of the part of a payload fairing. You can now see the inflatable heat shield at the top of the stack. This thing has a very interesting atmospheric entry procedure, which you'll see later. Yeah, I also slightly adjusted my command settings so we still have partial control when we lose a signal, since otherwise there'll be a bunch of just random I didn't bother signing up an actual communications network for this save. It's just my sandbox save for recording. So if I didn't allow partial control, then this mission would be far more difficult. Anyways, we're now plotting our maneuvers to first leave Kerbal, and then do a maneuver in space around Sonnah, do multiple maneuvers, first lower our periapsis, and then circularize our orbit. I actually was able to do, I did some testing with this, and found it could successfully re-enter if its apoapsis was at the height of the Mun's orbit, if you see on the map screen. I decided to go for a circular orbit to be safe. And if you saw the final trajectory there, well, I guess the final trajectory before leaving for Kerbal, that would still be adjusted. And now we begin burning to leave Kerbal. And our RCS is insufficient to provide ullage, so I need to go back and manually activate the engines anyways. But we're able to complete the maneuver successfully. Also, I realized it was in the final stages of planning this mission, I realized that I could have just done this in multiple launches, and the Zeppelin and transfer stage launched separately. Not really sure why I didn't think of that sooner, but yeah, no, this would have made a video just require far less, well, far more reasonable rocket. Anyways, we leave Kerbal behind, and we're now going to essentially just deorbit ourselves around Sonnah, and I don't know why I said essentially since that's exactly what we're doing. Electric charge is provided by those solar panels you see there. However, we don't really need them since the Zeppelin parts, which are from... I suddenly blank on the name of the mod, but I believe it's Heisenberg Airships. Not sure if I'm confusing it with... Well, it's a Hooligan Labs airships configured by I'm now confusing myself here, but yeah, it's the Raw Blue Industries Airships mod. Highly recommend it, nothing else really like it right now. But yeah, basically those parts can be configured to not only serve as an airship envelope, but also hold a bunch of electric charge, so this can just run on battery power and doesn't need solar panels. And I also did use a tweak skill on those airship parts. Normally, you're not meant to send airships to space, or at least not the way I'm doing it here. Actually, I tweak scaled the airship down a bit, so it fit in a more reasonable rocket. Anyways, we're performing one of the maneuvers to lower periapsis. I'm aiming for a periapsis that's decently close to the atmosphere, so we can maximize use of the Uber-Earth effect when lowering our apoapsis. And the trajectory is enabled to make sure our trajectory does not intersect the atmosphere. And once that is confirmed to be safe, we can time warp down and perform that apoapsis lowering maneuver after reorientating the spacecraft, which it turns very slowly. But yeah, we can now lower our apoapsis. Not sure why I can't speak right now. But yeah, we're in a fairly circular orbit. And so the first take of this reentry didn't go great. As you can see, there was some instability, and that caused some cracking attacks. So what you're seeing here is I believe, third or fourth attempt here. So first we're lowering our periapsis to be within the atmosphere. And now begins the actual reentry procedure. I've already deployed the inflatable heat shield, so now we'll reorientate, and whilst doing that, we'll jettison this upper stage. This scene actually, it's supposed to be orientated prograde with the heat shield forwards during descent. However, for some reason, MechJeb decided not to do that. I used the MechJeb Smart ASS because it worked better than stock SAS in testing. For whatever reason, it decided not to orientate correctly, so we're entering like this. Most reason I'm not retracting solar panels is because their destruction is a part of the reentry I keep saying reentry when it's just entry process. But yeah, they serve to add some additional drag to the craft to help slow it down. In fact, yeah, a bunch of this entire aeroshell is expendable, and importantly, pretty much every part of it is ablative. Yeah, we continue our descent. The solar panels are, as expected, broken by aerodynamic forces. And the actual solar panel parts are now being broken apart, as well as the fuel tanks from the RCS system. Which does mean we have very little control over the vehicle for the rest of the descent. However, this is a part of the intended descent procedure. Also, since we have limited probe control, I can't get rid of that maneuver node, and it's going to be annoying for the entire descent. Yeah, we're now just waiting until our speed gets low enough where we can safely just in the arrow shell and deploy the parachutes. Now at this point, I'll make multiple quick saves during this descent, since again this was not the first take. There were some Kraken attacks on previous takes which I wanted to avoid. And yeah, fairly soon I believe you'll see what happens. Well, just what happened during a less than a nominal attempt. Yeah, we're continuing to descend. And once our speed drops below 3 kilometers per second, I found in testing that that was usually sufficient to be able to deploy the aeroshell. That would then cause enough drag that the parachutes could then deploy. However, on this attempt, when I adjust in the aeroshell, the parachutes, despite saying they can deploy, will not deploy, which will then mean we don't slow down enough, which will mean aerodynamic heating will start to do serious damage to the aircraft. And as you can see, we now are losing very significant portions of just the airship envelope, and yeah, we cannot survive with that much lost. Now, I reloaded the quick save, and for some reason parachutes deployed far earlier than they're supposed to, but how 2 of them survived. I am not sure how this happened. I checked the cheat menu, I did not have anything enabled, and even then the parachutes are still affected by aerodynamic effects, regardless if you have unbreakable parts enabled. So I'm not very sure why they survived, but that means we can deploy the airshell, and we can descend without risk of melting off parts of the airship. So we can continue to descend, and once you see the Heisenberg airships and GUI there, once the buoyancy weight goes from being negative to being positive, you can just send the parachutes and the heat shield, and the airship can now fly on its own. And it's actually going to start ascending here pretty quickly. And so I'll have to turn on the altitude and altitude controls. But yeah, this is a fairly simple uncrewed airship. We have the envelope, as you can see. We have some electric motors, electric propellers for propulsion. And alongside the main envelope, we have some additional envelopes to provide some additional lift, since I found that we needed that in order to stay afloat. But yeah, as you saw there, we have air park on this install, which means that we can freeze the craft in place, which means we can time warp. And so yeah, I believe this was fairly successful. This craft now stay on Sonnah and continue to collect science, more accurately just remain on Sonnah and not get destroyed. I want to thank you for watching. The New Horizons Space Race will return hopefully next Monday, and goodbye.